Today's webinar is all about functional safety for the new year. I figured it was a new year. Let's start it off right by going back to some basics, either refreshing our memories or maybe learning it for the first time, and get down to the basics of functional safety. So what is functional safety? What are the standards? What do they say? And then we're going to talk about some three-letter acronyms that get thrown around a lot in functional safety. We're going to learn what is a CIF, a SIL, a CIS, and how they interact with each other and what they do. Then we can find out how those can be determined, how they can be used, and then why functional safety is important and all about good and realistic information. So as you can tell, there is a ton we are going to cover today. But I promise I will leave time at the end to answer any functional safety questions you might have, especially on any of the basics. You can ask the questions throughout the webinar, and I'll try and remember and stop and look at questions throughout, but I'm not going to lie, I'm not the best at that. But I will always leave time at the end. So feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar, and if I do not get to them beforehand, I will at the end. But let's go ahead and get started. For those of you that might not know me, there's actually a ton of people on today. That's really exciting. My name is Loren Stewart, and I work here at Exida. I am one of our CFSEs, and I work with our mechanical customers. So throughout the webinar, I'll usually be referring to mechanical examples. So excuse me if I do that often. But I also work with our academy. I'm one of our trainers that go out and teach the courses as well. For those of you, I see some people that we haven't necessarily seen before, so welcome. For those of you that might not know who Exida is, I like to say that no matter where you are in the supply chain of functional safety, if you're the OEM and starting things out, building that valve, that actuator, that solenoid that's going to be used in safety systems, the whole way through to those end users using those certified products. We have things to make your life easier, whether it's tools, certification, we have training, we have consulting, everything to help make your functional safety world an easier time. And just in case you're curious, Exida, I like to say no matter where you are, where your customers are in the world, we have somebody close by that can help you out with functional safety, alarm management, and cybersecurity. So no matter where you need us to get to, where you need us to be familiar with, we have experts all over the place. And this is actually not even our most up-to-date because we've opened more offices since this has been updated last. And then the final piece of information about Exida that I really like to share is that we like to study, we like to research, we like to be on the cutting edge of everything going on in the functional safety world. And we feel with that knowledge, if we get it out there, it really will make the world a safer place. So everything we research, everything we do, our procedures, our templates, everything are in books. We publish it. We publish white papers. As you know from being on here, we have free webinars and free blogs. So we try and get all of that information out on the market and share everything that we're learning. So if you want more information, go to our website, check out the webinars, the blogs, the books, the white papers are free to download as well. And if you want extra information, I have some training courses at the end of the presentation that I can share with you guys. But let's go ahead and get started why you're really here today, all about the functional safety basics. So as I said, we're going to start off with kind of clearing the slate and starting off with the very basic definitions and building on from there. So we're going to very first start with the definition of functional safety. And a lot of people think, well, functional safety, you want to make sure the job's going to be done correct, right? Actually, functional safety is more than that. You're going to be looking at that automatic safety function that, yes, it does its intended function correctly, or that the system will fail in a predictable or a safe manner. And that that is a key portion of functional safety, that you want your safety system to perform its intended task, but if that cannot happen, you want it to fail in some predictable or safe manner. This whole webinar, we're going to be talking a lot about one of the main safety standards, IEC 61508. And IEC 61508 was the first basic functional safety standard. There were people from all sorts of countries all over the world that got together from national standard bodies that wanted to make one place for functional safety standards worldwide. So they put all of their expertise together and created IEC 61508. And IEC 61508, it has a lot of great information in it. It has to do, once again, with the automatic protection system to make sure that the job is either done correctly of the safety system or it fails in a safe or predictable manner. We're going to be talking about how the standard not only protects against random hardware failures and the failure rates from FAMIDAs, but it also protects against systematic design failures, and that would be the systematic capability. And we'll look into both of those coming up on later in the webinar. IEC 61508 can be applied to both project and product level work. And that means that the way it was written, it can be interpreted for a one-off, completely customized product, or it can be applied to a product that sits on the shelf and is used in multiple applications in multiple different ways. IEC 61508 is not a prescriptive standard like most are. What that means is most standards tell you exactly the way they want you to behave in the order they want you to do, saying, I want you to do step 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in that order. When you're finished, then do A, B, C, and D. IEC 61508, however, is written as giving you an end goal, that what functional safety is important for. And it allows you as a company to adjust and alter how you take into consideration functional safety. So it is a little more customizable, I should say. IEC 61508 is that basic standard that was developed for really anyone that's using electrical, electronic, or programmable electronic devices in any products. Really should be following this standard. The way it's written, it's targeted, the tone of voice is really targeted to suppliers, those OEMs that are designing the components and subsystems going into the safety functions. However, it's really good ideas for end users to be familiar with what's going on because it has all of the information in it that says what's required of the people that are buying their products. So if you are an end user buying certified devices for IEC 61508, you will know that they're meeting all of the requirements laid out in this standard. The standard is broken up into two main sections. The first section is broken up into 4 parts, and it's all of the rules, the regulations, everything that needs to be considered if you are going to be certified. And then in the back, there are 3 guideline parts, kind of examples and suggestions on how to do things. In the standard, it's going to define the concepts of SIL, of SIF, of SIS, and we'll talk about what all of those mean. And it also talks about having some type of functional safety life cycle. It does give it an example, but you can use any sort of safety life cycle and follow that approach. And that's how you're going to get rid of those systematic design errors. In the standard, it talks about certification and that a third-party certification is not required. However, a lot of end users do push back and say, well, you know, it's great that you say how great you are, but when a third party comes in and says it, it's a different, whole different ballgame, right? And then finally, we get asked this all of the time. In most situations, IEC 61508, it always started out as a non-governmental industry standard, and it's starting to pick up speed. More and more countries are adopting it as best engineering practices. Currently, its use is so prevalent that it's almost hazardous for a company to ignore the standard's recommendations. Most societies were becoming more and more risk adverse, especially if you live in the United States, and how so crazy and logistical the world is becoming. But the more risk averse the world is coming, the more you want to put in these practices to minimize your risk. And the more industrialized the world is becoming, the more we are looking to become more risk averse. In some countries, the standard is becoming more accepted by governments and enforced by law, but I would say most situations, the standard is just typically cited as best or common engineering practices. It's often going to be required by end users saying, well, we want a SIL rated product. We need a SIL 2 or a SIL 3 CIF. I need a third party certificate, show me. However, if IEC 61508 is kind of ignored, brushed under the table, and an accident does happen, yes, it wasn't a law that you had to follow the standard. However, especially in civil cases, do you want to be asking or answering the question, other engineers were using the standard, everybody kind of knows this as best engineering practices, why didn't you? So it could be a costly mistake as well. The standards can kind of be confusing, how they're all numbered and broken up. So this is how just a few of them are laid out. IEC 61508, that is the umbrella standard. It's that general overall standard for performance-based all industry, but it's really toned and spoken as to suppliers. Underneath IEC 61508, there becomes more industry-specific standards. So there's going to be a standard for machinery, a standard for nuclear. You're going to have a standard for automotive, all of that, cyber. Then you also have your IEC 61511. That's your process industry sector. That is the standard that most end users will use. That is very complementary to IEC 61508, but takes those concepts in IEC 61508 and puts them in the view of the end users. Most of this webinar, I'm going to be talking about IEC 61508. Every once in a while, I will slip a 511 reference in if we are talking about more of the end user's point of view. So, functional safety, I swear whoever came up with functional safety loved three-letter acronyms more than anything else in the world. There are tons and tons and tons of them. It's hard to keep everything straight. However, we are going to be talking about the three main starting blocks of functional safety: SIL, SIF, and SIS. And I put it all on one slide so you didn't have to be flipping back and forth, because especially SIF and SIS can kind of get confusing. So let's start out with SIL. SIL, if you've heard of functional safety, that's probably the first thing you're going to hear of. And a SIL is a safety integrity level. And these are 4 different levels, 1 through 4, and they are going to show how well the safety function is going to do its job, how much risk can be taken out. Next, we have a SIF, which is a safety instrumented function. And a safety instrumented function, if you think, is kind of simplified, it's going to be one set of actions corresponding equipment needs to go with one single hazard to bring it to a safe state. So if you think about it, you have a set of equipment, a single set, maybe some sensors, a logic solver, a final element, and this set of equipment is going to look for one single hazard scenario. And that set of equipment needs to take action to bring it to a safe state. So a SIF is going to be usually measured by how much risk can be removed. And it's usually expressed in either a PFDavg or expressed in a SIL. So when you have your set of equipment, your SIF, it's going to have a specified SIL on how well it does its job. Okay, now let's get ready to get a little more confusing. So let's introduce what a SIS is. A SIS is a safety instrumented system. And this is a little more complex. It can be one or more than one safety instrumented functions put together to do a full job. So if you think about it, a SIS can encompass multiple different functions and act in multiple different ways to overcome multiple different hazard scenarios. Whereas your SIF can only a single set of equipment doing a single action to prevent a single hazard. So your SIS can have a bunch of different SIF compiled. Your SIS could have one SIF, it could have 5 SIFs all put together. But if you think about it, each SIF has an individual safety integrity level. So when you are speaking of a safety integrity level, you are speaking for each SIF. And it is incorrect to say a safety integrity level for the entire SIFs, because you might have multiple different safety integrity levels for them. So what is this safety integrity level? As I said before, it's 4 different levels, 1 through 4, 1 being the lowest, 4 being the highest. And it's a judge on how well your SIF is doing its job. So if you think about it, a SIL 1 is going to do its job okay, where a SIL 2, how much risk is it taking out of the system? It's going to be able to remove more risk from the system, whereas SIL 3 is an order of magnitude higher. It's going to be able to take out more risk, and SIL 4, so on. One thing to note is IEC 61508 defines all 4 safety integrity levels, while IEC 61511 kind of only talks about 3. That's because IEC 61511 is more geared towards the end users and process safety. And really, SIL 4 is not used in the process safety sector, except if you're in a rare situation such as nuclear or some rail applications. So IEC 61511 actually refers back to IEC 61508, saying, see all of the requirements in that standard, we're not dealing with it. So in the standards, there are tables that we're going to look at associated with each of these SIL levels. So how can you find out a SIL of a device, of a product? Well, the standards IEC 61508 says to find a SIL of a device, of a product, of a CIF, you need to do 3 things. And it's not just one of 3 things or 2 of 3 things. It's all of these 3 things completely. You wouldn't believe how many times we see people cherry picking at this point. Well, I did really good at the probability of failure, or I did really great with the architectural constraints. I don't have to worry about the SIL capability, right? No, absolutely not. The standard says unless you meet all 3 of these things, you do not have SIL compliance. So, what are those 3 things? The first is systematic capability, then architectural constraints, and finally the probability of failure. So let's look into each of these a little bit more in detail, starting with the systematic capability. So systematic capability is usually one that kind of gets swept under the rug, and that's not a good thing. Systematic capability is all about the quality management system and having it audited to all of the requirements of IEC 61508. So, if you remember back, SIL 1 was the lowest. It didn't take as much risk out. So, if you look in the standard, there's going to be all of these requirements for a SIL 1 application. We're going to look at how a company makes their modifications, if they use an impact analysis, how they notify their customers if there's a recall, how they get their information out, like the FMIDAs and the certificates and the safety manuals. We go through their process, their procedures, their documentation, all of that information. So, like I said, you have a bunch of rules and requirements, documents that are needed for a SIL 1. But remember, I said a SIL 2 was an order of magnitude greater. So if you have a SIL 2 product or you're buying a SIL 2 device, that product met all of the requirements for SIL 1 plus all of the additional requirements for SIL 2. Same thing with 3, all of the requirements for 1, 2, and 3, and so on. So if a product's quality management system checked off every single box of that SIL capability rating, you will get a certificate, and the certificate, you can see I blew it up right here, that says it is SIL 3 capable, this product. What does that mean? Well, this is saying that whatever this device is, whether it's a logic solver, a sensor, a valve, anything you can think of, this can go into up to a SIL 3 CIF. It is a limiting factor. So, if you have a SIL 2 ball valve that you bought, it can go into a SIL 2 application, a SIL 1 application, a SIL nothing application, but it will never be okay to go into a SIL 3 application. And I don't care how many of those you stick in. You can put 4 of those SIL 2 valves in to cover one SIL 3. It will not count. So that SIL capability rating is a limiting factor and on all of the certificates. The next is architectural constraints. So architectural constraints, once again, will be done in a product certification, but this is done from the results in the FMEDA, or Failure Mode Effect and Diagnostic Analysis. And that's where we get the failure rates, we can get all of that information, and it will be analyzed one of 2 ways. IEC 61508 says you can analyze it through Route 1H or Route 2H. It's up to the product. So Route 1H is the safe failure fraction. You might be familiar with this. It is basically the ratio of what will cause a spurious trip or be detected before a problem could occur compared to all of the failures that could happen. And we look at that safe and dangerous failures from the FMEDA results. So if you are purchasing a device that is certified, on the back of the certificate will have the failure rates that you can do your safe failure fraction calculation for. The other method is Route 2H. And Route 2H, you might have heard of it, it's kind of that prior use justification or proven in use. And this is letting you take credit for reliability data for the products. And both of these, whether it's analyzed per Route 1H or Route 2H, will be written right on the product certificate in the assessment report, the FMEDA report, all over. And we're going to look further into architectural constraints a little bit later in the webinar. And then that third circle for compliance, or that third barrier that you need to overcome, or that third hurdle, is the PFDavg calculation. And the PFDavg calculation is going to be done, it can be a simplified equation based on just a few things, such as your dangerous failure rates, your system diagnostics, your proof test interval, or it can be a much more complex equation with up to 9 different variables, the whole way looking at your maintenance capability, proof test coverage, how everything you're doing, and it can get quite complex. However, we're just going to briefly touch on it today. If you want more information on PFDavg calculation, I'm going to show you the calculation later, but we have webinars on just this topic later, or on the website if you want more information on PFDavg. So thinking back to our circles, you can think of these as those barriers or hurdles that you need to overcome. You can't just think of 1 or 2 of these. You're only going to get complete compliance if you check off all of the boxes for all 3. So if a product is certified and the certificate is finished, they did all of this information. If you are using certified products, you will know that these things, you are still going to have to use the SIL in the appropriate way, but the product was designed correctly for you. So now that we know what all went into making a SIL product, now that's great and all, but what do I do now? How do I use this information? What does SIL mean to an end user? Well, SIL can be used in 4 different ways, and some of these we might have already touched on briefly, but it can be used to establish risk reduction, to look at probable limits in random hardware failures, to look at those architectural constraints that we briefly touched about, and to establish systematic capability. So let's once again take a deeper dive into all 4 of these. So the first is to look at risk reduction. In the standards IEC 61508 and IEC 61511, there are different tables, and they associate each safety integrity level with an order of magnitude in risk reduction. Risk reduction, remember we thought back to what does a CIF need to do? It needs to take risk out of the system. And each safety function needs to have a requirement to reduce that risk. If you don't have a requirement to reduce any risk, you don't need any SIL. You don't have to deal with functional safety. It can just be normal process. But if you've done all of your PHAs or HAZOP, you've determined you still need to remove risk, that's when we incorporate that SIL. So each SIL level is going to be 1 order of magnitude. Once again, that SIL 1 being taking out the least amount of risk. SIL 2, an order of magnitude up, it takes out more risk. SIL 3 takes out even more risk. And SIL 4, well, we know that that's kind of that impossible or very rare case scenario. So what does risk reduction mean in the real world, though? I like to use examples. I'm a very visual person. So risk reduction, you tell me it removes risk from the system, but my brain doesn't necessarily connect that to a real world scenario. Sorry about that. So let's say we have a PHA, and that you did the PHA and we found out that there's some kind of hazard in your company that could occur once every 10 years. And if that happened, this major release of toxic fumes happens and spews into the atmosphere. Well, as you can imagine, that's not necessarily something that the people that own your company want happening every 10 years. That's going to be deemed unacceptable. The owner, the CEO, your board determined what was acceptable is that hazard to occur once in every 500 years. So you need to determine your risk reduction factor. And it's very simple. You just take that 500 years compared to the 10 years, what it actually could be. You need to take 50, risk reduction of 50 out of your system. So because of this standard, we have these wonderful tables. We can see, well, 50, that falls right in between 10 and 100. Great, I need a SIL 1 application. Hold on. You could have a SIL 1 application, but what if you design your safety system, you put it in place, and your calculations, you find out it might have been in that 10 to 50 range. What if the risk reduction was only 20? So you could be running a CIF without as much risk reduction as needed. So I always tell my customers, when you are specifying a safety integrity level, always say, I need a SIL 1 with at least a risk reduction factor of 50. Or you can simply bump up a safety integrity level and say, I will be covered no matter what SIL 2 I get. The next way you can use your SIL is to set probabilistic limits for random hardware failures. What does that mean? That's your PFDavg. You want to look at the probability of a failure occurring. Depending on if you're in low demand mode or high demand mode of operation. If you're in low demand mode, you're going to look over an average of your proof test interval and that probability of failure. If you are in high demand mode of application, you are going to look at just a slice of an hour's time. So you would actually use a different table than this and use the probability of failures per hour, or PFH. So once again, this table comes straight from the standard, and this is just the low demand mode of operation. Just like the risk reduction factor, each level is an order of magnitude higher. Just like the quality management system, SIL 1 is kind of the easiest to get, SIL 2 a little harder, SIL 3 harder, and so on. As I said before when we touched about this earlier, the PFDavg, this is a little, not just the most simplified equation, this is a little more complex. This takes into consideration your proof test coverage, your dangerous undetected failure rates from the FMETA, your proof test interval, your mission time into this calculation. However, your PFDavg can get very complex equation, up to 9 different variables of things that could alter the probability of failure. As I said when we touched on this earlier, if you want more information on PFDavg, PFH, we have webinars, full-hour webinars just on this topic. The next way you can use your SIL as an end user is to determine your architectural constraints. This is that same as we talked about earlier, the 1H or the 2H, but this is a different approach. Same thing you're doing before. Route 1H is going to be your safe failure fraction, where route 2H is going to be your more prior use justification, and each of these routes have, once again, associated tables in them. So in this example, there are different tables for, once again, low demand or high demand. There's different tables for how complex the system is. These are simple mechanical devices, but if you have internal diagnostics and smart devices, there are different tables. But this is for an example. Let's start with route 1H. We can figure out our architecture by matching up SILs. So say we have a let's take a ball valve, simple mechanical device, right? And we did the safe failure fraction and found out that our safe failure fraction is a 75%. We can then use these tables in the standard and say, great, if I know from all of my analysis I need a SIL 2, I can find my hardware fault tolerance is 0. So what's hardware fault tolerance? Well, that is how many extra sets of equipment are to do that same job. This is going to be your architecture. So for a hardware fault tolerance of 0, there's no extra set of equipment. This is going to be a 1 out of 1, a 2 out of 2. This number of devices, same number of devices to shut down the system, are the number of total devices. So looking at hardware fault tolerance 1, that's going to have 1 extra set of devices. So that could be your system is set up a 1 out of 2 or a 2 out of 3. As a hardware fault tolerance of 2 would be even up a level. That would be your 1 out of 3, 2 out of 4. I've seen all sorts of crazy, I've seen 6 out of 8. There's all sorts of architecture configurations you can do, but this table is going to let you know what you need to at least have. So for a safe failure fraction of 75%, if you've done your analysis, you know you need a SIL 2 application, you can say, well, I can just use a 1 out of 1, I'm fine. But if you've done your analysis and you need to remove more risk, that's a very risky safety function, and we need to pull more risk out of it. I need to be a SIL 3. Instead, I need to have a 1 out of 2. That might mean I have 2 ball valves set up in series, so it doesn't matter if only one of them works. It will still do its job. It has a full extra set of equipment doing the same job. On route 2H, you can see the table's a little more simplified, still has the same concept of hardware fault tolerance and the different SIL levels. However, route 2H, we no longer have the safe failure fraction calculation. We're going to be using that high quality data, that prior use justification. And you can use these tables associated with it. Once again, if you're buying a certified product, this is already going to be listed in your FMETA report, your assessment report, your certificate. All of that stuff should be given to you. And then finally, you can do it. Use your SIL to establish your systematic capability. So if you're buying certified products, the certification, I zoomed in off of this one real quick. You can see this is laid out. Let me see if I can get a little pointer here. On the certificate, it has a lot of information. So this is just zoomed in here. It's saying this is SIL 3 capable. So that's that systematic capability. Even below in this section, this says systematic capability, SIL 3 capable. The random capability, route 2H, and this is saying for the PFDavg and architectural constraints must be verified for each application. So if you're buying a certified product, all of this information is on the certificate ready for you. How do you know if it's a certified product or not? If you're not given this information, I always suggest going to the SAEL. That's this website here. You can simply put in your the product name, the company name, all of that information, and you can search to see if a certificate comes up on it or not. So now we know what a SIS is, we know what a SIF is, we know what a SIL is, we know how you've gotten your SIL, we know how you can use your SIL. Who really cares? Why does this stuff matter? It's just a bunch of tiny, 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 tiny numbers. Who cares? Well, think back on why we wanted that safety system. It's to remove risk, and that risk was deemed unacceptable by your company. You had too much of it to begin with. So you're trying to really, when it comes down to it, prevent serious injury or potential deadly disasters. These are just 3 of very well-known disasters, and unfortunately, all of these had massive consequences. There were numbers of people killed, numbers of people injured, huge toxic releases, cleanup. When you think about your SIF and your SIS and your SIL, relate it back to thinking about, well, this is in place to reduce personnel injury, to reduce personnel deaths, to reduce personnel risk, to reduce environmental risk, to reduce financial risk. It's to really prevent these huge deadly disasters. Now, you know it's important to have functional safety. Now it's not just important to apply these concepts, but it's important to apply them in a credible and realistic way as well. And this is coming straight from the standard. Both IEC 61508 and 511 mention it, and it talks about where data comes from. If you're using reliability data, it needs to be credible, traceable, documented, and justified. And in both versions of the new standards, in 61508, the 2010 version of the standard, and 61511, the 2016 version of the standard, they both up the language in this section. And it was really in response to seeing people using overly optimistic or just plain bad data integrity. So they really said, no more getting around it. We really need good data. If you are putting lives and removing risk, you need to have good data integrity. So what does that look like? having optimistic data leads to unsafe design. I always say look at a big bridge. Think of functional safety as a bridge. And if you cherry pick what you're doing, or if you use overly optimistic data, you could have not enough redundancy, you could have not enough testing, not often enough testing, your architecture could be wrong, and all of a sudden your risk reduction that you calculated you needed is not going to be there. So if you cherry pick which portions of functional safety you're going to use, it's just like this bridge. You might not be taking out the main support, but taking out enough little ones, it's going to collapse the bridge as well. So how do you know if your data is good or not? I always refer all of my customers to silsafedata.com. It is what I call my sanity check. It gives you a lot of different types of devices, and it's pretty generic. It's going to say valve, triple offset butterfly valve, close on trip. So it's going to give you application, the type, and the category, but not a lot more specifics. I'm going to give you a range of failure rates, and these are in fits. These are your dangerous failure rates. And it's going to give you a lower bounds and upper bounds. And some of them are quite large because who knows how there could be a vast variety of complexity in that category. But it will give you a reality check. I kind of just zoomed in on motor controllers, and this section, let's say you're looking for a motor contactor. This is going to say, well, I fit into this lower one, so I'm going to fall in between 100 to 500 fits. Once again, that's a large range. There could be different complexities on those motor contactors that I'm not sure of, but if I'm handed a failure rate of 2 fits, I'm going to say, well, between 100 and 500, and I'm given 2. Is my motor contactor really an order of magnitude better than anything else in the market ever was? Or is that unrealistic or over-optimistic data? If you are ever in a situation where you have over-optimistic data, I always tell my customers, go to SilSafe Data, use that upper limit kind of as a generic number. It's going to give you conservative results. However, what are you protecting against? Is it something that could have a fatality? Well, I would prefer to be conservative if a fatality is on the line. Once again, I told you I'm a visual person. What does this look like? So if you are collecting data, say for a solenoid valve, and you collect data from Arita, you look at data from pipelines, from FAMIDAs, from field failure data, and everything's coming around this area, except you see a few things coming way multiple order of magnitudes below. Compare it to SilSafe Data. You can see different complexities have different low limit values. However, both of those would kind of be a red flag in my mind. You know, was this information just done on field return data, or just done on cycle testing or high demand mode? Maybe this wasn't the right application for the process industry. So if I got information like this, that's when I would kind of use that generic information, or at least go back, say, where did this info come from? How did you get these numbers? Is it an apples to apples comparison? Is it appropriate? So I'm going to stop and take a little break for questions because I was horrible and did not do any questions throughout. I'm sorry. And if you think of questions later, please feel free to email me. And always check us out. Look at our reference material, those blogs, those white papers, the webinars, the books that I told you about earlier. And if you absolutely loved functional safety so much in this webinar and you need more information, we have some trainings coming up. We have them all over, actually some even outside of the United States, and some more online self-paced training as well. If you wanted more information, go to our website. And then let me go ahead. So the first question we have is about architecture. There was a comment saying a lot of exida certificates seem to be Route 2H. Why? Yes, you are absolutely right. Well, in 2010, when Route 2H was introduced, it was introduced because people were trying to cheat the system with safe failure fraction and entering in a lot of no effect failures into the calculation. So they changed the calculation to no longer have no effect failures. However, that really hurt simple mechanical devices like valves, actuators, solenoids. They don't have any of those safe failures built into them. So their safe failure fraction is going to be 50%, 40%, something very low on their own. When you are building your CIF, the standard says whatever you choose for each one of your devices in your safety function, your sensors, your logic solvers, all of those final elements. If you do Route 1H or Route 2H, you have to do all of them the same. So we usually allow for a Route 2H certification as well if the data will allow, because of the devices, those simple mechanical devices like a valve can be unfairly punished with the safe failure fraction. The next question is about 2H proven in use data, talking about being limited per the operating device. When we look at the device, we always look at the environment. We have different environmental profiles that we evaluate it at, and the device could be evaluated at multiple different environments and applications. And that's usually in the FMETA report if there's different failure rates for different operating environments. The next question we have, these are great questions, by the way. The next question we have is IEC 61508 a requirement by OSHA? That is kind of a gray area. OSHA does not say you specifically have to use IEC 61508. However, OSHA does say you need to be using best engineering and common engineering practices. In the world, IEC 61508 is considered the common and best engineering practices. So no, it is not mandatory or a requirement, but if you get yourself into an accident or a situation or litigation, they could and will ask you why you weren't using the best engineering practices if you are supposedly following OSHA. The next question is about ISA 84. ISA 84 has actually merged with the IEC 61511, so they are now together. The next question, if the end user uses a certificate that's based on 2H, will they still need to provide the proven in use justification? No. If you have something like an exida certificate and it says that this product in this environment has already been approved per Route 2H, your homework is already done. That's the benefit of buying those certified products. You just take it. You still have to do your calculations to make sure that you're going to hit all of your risk reduction targets, but you don't have to do the proven in use justification yourself. And then the final question I have is, what is the effect of the test interval during the SIL calculations? I think you're talking about the PFDavg calculations. And this is going to, if you shorten your test interval or expand your test interval, it's going to let possibly more dangerous undetected failures creep in. So depending on your proof test coverage and the proof test intervals, and if you're following the proof test directions, you might have different effects. My best suggestion for you is if you have a tool like Excelentia, they do the SIL calculations in the background for you, and you can see the adjustment of extending or reducing your proof test, or even trying a different type of proof test. And we have webinars just on the subject as well on proof tests, but there are different ways you can change your proof test coverage by doing a more extensive proof test. If there's ways you can do a small proof test once a year, or maybe more comprehensive proof test once every 3 years. There's things that you can do. If you want more information, we can get you in touch with someone to show you that as well. Oh, some more came in, so hold on. We have a question about mixing and matching Route 2H and 1H devices within a CIF. No, right now you cannot be mixing Route 2H and Route 1H devices. You need to evaluate the entire CIF per Route 2H or the entire CIF for the safe failure fraction, or the entire CIF for both. We have a question on what the percentage coverage, I'm assuming proof test coverage would be if you don't test the final element regularly, and the longer it does not get tested, the higher your PFD average is going to be, the lower proof test coverage number you're going to have. I don't feel comfortable just giving out a number. That's per individual device, per individual maker, per individual application, and which steps you're actually going to be using. And then last question we have, I think. So if you say, for example, you have a facility with several SIL 1 CIFs, say around 60 are required, only two SIL CIFs, and maybe a SIL 3. Say around, is a SIL 3 capable CIF required, or a SIL capable 2 CIF sufficient? So this goes back to your risk reduction calculations. You're going to need to know that limiting factor. If we're only talking about systematic capability, you can use whatever the highest systematic capability you need is. So for example, you only need a few SIL 2 CIFs. Everything can be a SIL 2, and you can just know that you're fine. However, you don't need to have SIL 2 equipment in a SIL 1 CIF. You can have specific equipment for your SIL 2 CIF, specific equipment for your SIL 1 CIF. That's fine. What I think you're getting at is that risk reduction when I said you had to bump up to the next level. So whenever you calculate your risk reduction for each CIF needed, that's when you need to either say, I am a SIL 2 with at least this risk reduction, or a SIL 3. But if you're talking generally in your facility, you can have all your SIL 1 CIFs be SIL 1, all your SIL 2 CIFs be SIL 2, because you're not going to have a SIL for the entire CIF. Okay, I think that is all for the questions. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed your webinar today. Hopefully you have a great 2019 and a happy and healthy and safe one. Thank you so much for joining us.